Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out in the rain. Good to spend the time with you. We are going to, again, the goal has been to make these continuous but self-contained. So just to give a little bit of backdrop in terms of what we've been up to until now, to try to explore what role or what the basis of some concept of social justice would be in Judaism. We spent the first round trying to sort out exactly how tzedek is distinguished from tzedakah and gemilut chasadim, and some things around that. Last time, I think we spent more time trying to knock out, I think, some of the basic categories that we, as Americans, I guess, kind of look to when you think about social justice, which have to do with equality, government intervention, and some kind of philosophy of wealth redistribution. If you think about what Judaism has to say on each of those, I mean, in my mind, I summarize it. I oversimplify it as saying that there's not much that suggests that equality per se is a value in Judaism in that kind of stated way. The idea of redistribution is something that was certainly debated in Judaism, and there's a mild form of it in Shlita, Yovel kinds of rules, but not something that's prevalent all the time. You'd say it's part of the way that the economy is set up. But you still have strands within Jewish thought, which then became certainly a very strong mode of Christian thought, which said that separating yourself from wealth is really what it means to be a good religious person, and some semblance of it all belongs to God should then generate this redistributive disposition. That is not the thing that became dominant in Judaism. So if you think about equality, I don't think you really have it. If you think of redistribution, you have something like it, but not this kind of very strong form of it. And in terms of government intervention, you certainly do find it in terms of kofanot tzedakah and stuff like that. But again, exactly why is not clear. Where we ended up last week was showing that tzedakah per se, the Gemara says you're kofa, you can force the giving of tzedakah, you can assess and force it. And then there was a debate about whether that's because it really stems from the obligation, as the fact is that what's mine is not really totally mine, and so the government can take it away, which is one interpretation of it, or a softer form, which was I have a moral obligation, and the Gemara can, and the Beit can force me to do that. And as mentioned on the way out, there's something in between that. We didn't get to it in the Marami Rutenberg, which is if you kind of take one extreme as it all belongs to God, the government should be able to have the right or responsibility to redistribute on the one end. If you have kind of another end that says, no, I have my moral obligation, and the Beit Din can push that. There's a different kind of sense, which is a third way of thinking about it, which is kind of a social contract kind of idea, which is that people kind of agree that there are certain commitments that they make. But we're going to leave that as, where I want to start here is saying that in those three categories that are basic, you don't really find convincing, I don't think those serve as the basis for Jewish social justice, not redistribution, not equality per se, and a moderate form of government intervention. I'd like to try to go in a different direction. I don't mean this in a conclusive kind of way either, because I think there are lots of ways that you can shape this, but I want to talk about the idea of recognition and human dignity as the basis for social justice. Recognition has become in the past bunch of years a way of thinking about social justice. It stems from, so it's like a nuanced difference, but what it means is I have an obligation to recognize, to acknowledge, like the existence of another person. Like you can imagine that we can go through society and there are people who you don't even pay attention to. It's like not on my radar screen. Now, I just want to kind of note the difference between whether the starting point, as the things we've been talking about in the past, which are kind of economic-ish kinds of starting points. This is not an economic starting point. This is a recognizing the dignity of another person kind of starting point. That is different than economics. It's also different from kind of a human rights discourse, which starts with every person has a right. This is kind of my obligation to, if there are people there, that they have to be present to me and not kind of disappearing into the background. What I'd like to do is try to argue, try to push, use a bunch of sources here which start with Psukim and far off Psukim, so to speak, and the Gemara, and then try to show how the Rambam develops, I think, this idea. I'm being a little anachronistic, meaning I don't think the Rambam had an idea of like recognition, but you're going to see kind of the flow of what his values are. So I just want to check whether that's a distinction that makes sense. Meaning the difference between saying that it doesn't start with economics per se, it actually doesn't even start with individual rights to stuff. That's not something that's obviously Jewish either necessarily. It starts with my responsibility to recognize the existence of other people and realize that they're there. That's a kind of a dignity-based kind of idea, and it's my responsibility to grant dignity and recognition to other people. Now, where do you see that in, kind of Jewish thinking? That's what we're trying to do. I'm just going to check that that is coherent. Yeah.
When you go anywhere and there are working people, nobody pays attention to them.
Yeah.
And when you greet them, all you have to do is say hello. They are so grateful.
Right. So it can range from people who are the truly down and out, right? And that's obviously people say we can think about the homeless from an economic perspective. You can think about the homeless from a dignity perspective. There'll be overlap in how you deal with the problem, but you're starting from a different place. But even if it's not that extreme, you can have the service in whatever place that you're in, right? You don't pay attention to the people who are there. That's kind of people blending into the background, not acknowledging their existence. That kind of recognition, right, expands. It's not about poverty, actually. And I just want to point, because it's going to point back to what we mentioned 2 times ago, when we started, that the difference between tzedakah and chesed, if you remember, is that tzedakah is for poor people, it's about poverty, and chesed is not about poverty. What is tzedek about? In this orientation, it's not about poverty either. It doesn't only have to do with being poor. And if you'll remember, the idea of tzedek in Tanakh comes from the way in which it's repeated over and over again is its focus on the ger yatom v'almanah. The ger yatom v'almanah argues not the same thing as the ani, although there are ways in which they are similar, because it distinguishes one aspect of the person that is true for the ani, but it's not the economic side of what's true for the ani. It is the lack of recognition side that can be true for the ani, that will be true for the ger, for the yatom, the almanah. So, right, that push is that the focus on the ger yatom is to try to make sure that when we think about that, when Judaism thinks about this kind of idea of social justice, it's not just about rectifying poverty and thinking about economics. It's actually broader than that, and that it's about giving identity, giving presence to people who kind of fall in the background. And that's the idea of the ger yatom v'almanah in a way that's different than an ani, right? Okay, so I'd like to try to, so where do you see such a thing? So we're going to start with from a nothing that seemingly has to do with this, which is the Parsha of Eglah Arufah. It is a bizarre, seemingly bizarre halacha that's described at the end of Parshat Shoftim, and it talks about the case where a corpse is found in between cities, and they don't know what happened to the person, and there's no one to take responsibility for it. So the Torah describes in Pasuk Aleph on the sheet, Ki matzei chalal ba'adama asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha l'mishta, nofel basadeh, lo noda mi hikahu. We don't know who committed the crime, we don't know how the person died. The next psukim, which I didn't bet to hay, which I cut out just for simplicity's sake, basically describes, first of all, the city is responsible to take care of this person, of this corpse. Which city is responsible? So famously, the Torah describes that you measure from where the corpse is, and the Gemara actually gets into the details of what part of the body do you measure from, so that you can figure out exactly it's closer to which city, and the city that it's closest to has to take responsibility to provide for the burial, etc. Now, when you read these psukim, it's like a very, I guess this happens, right? But why is this so important? Not only that, like there's a ritual. What's the ritual? So you have to take an eglah. You have to take a calf, bring it to Nachal Eitan. You have to bring it to a the banks, whether that's a specific place called Nachal Eitan, or it is just a Nachal, which is a river that is Eitan, which is strong, meaning either the water is flowing or the soil is hard so that things can't grow there. There are all kinds of explanations to what it means. And you have to break the neck of the eglah. It's a rough sounding ritual. And then, and all that is a kind of, you can imagine, goes off into its own discussion. I want to discuss that part of the ritual. I want to get to Pasuk Vav. What's this all about? So the Torah says, "V'chol ziknei ha'ir ahi ha'krovim el ha'chalal yirchatzu et yedehem al ha'eglah ha'arufa b'nachal." The Torah says that the zkenim of the city have to come. That is, right, you got to get the Beit Din out there, and the Beit Din has to wash their hands in the river, basically put their hands over the eglah arufa, yirchatzu et yedehem al ha'eglah arufa b'nachal. The washing is some kind of cleansing thing that has to happen with the eglah arufa in the nachal. V'anu v'amru. This is what they have to say.
This is before the killing?
This is right after they find the body.
No, but this is before the eglah has been slaughtered?
No, after. Yeah. Ve'anu ve'amru yadenu lo shafchu et. And it's an odd carbon, like meaning it's not shechted, it's not in the mikdash, but that's how that's how we do these kinds of things, like animal something, but it's clearly something like that but different. So after that happens, you say the vidui, so of some sort. It's a kapara of sorts. For what? So that's the Torah says yadenu lo shafchu et hadam hazeh ve'inenu lo ra'u. So the Torah says that the Beit Din says, our hands did not spill this blood, and our eyes did not see. Kaper lamcha Yisrael asher padita Hashem. Bring kapara to Am Yisrael that you redeemed from Mitzrayim. V'al titein dam naki b'kerev amcha Yisrael. And do not place clean blood amongst amcha Yisrael, amongst your people. V'nikaper lahem hadam. And somehow this dam should be as a kapara. So basically, you're bringing this animal to serve as a kapara for the Ziknei Beit Din, and they make this declaration, we didn't commit the murder. So the Gemara and everyone says, what is this about? What's the idea of this? And I want to just focus on the one particular line, not the specifics of the ritual or anything like that, but the vidui that they say. They say, so the Mishnah already asked the question, and the Breita spells out a drop more. So according to the Breita rather than the Mishnah, if you look at the next source, it's Gemara in Sota Daf Mem Vav Mem Bet. Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan ve'amru yadeinu lo shafchu et hadam hazeh ve'inenu lo ra'u. That quotes the pasuk, and then the Gemara says, V'chi al libenu al ta shebeit din shofchim damim. What's their declaration? We didn't commit a murder. We didn't do it, right? It's kind of, you find a body, and then the Beit Din comes and says, we didn't commit the murder. So what's the question on that? Methinks that thou doth protest too much, right? What do you mean? Who said that you did the murder? Where's that coming from? Would anybody think Shebeit Din Shofchim Damim? Ella, so this is Chazal's interpretation of this line, Lo ba liadenu uptarnuhu below mizonot. This is what they're claiming. He lo shafchu. What does it mean lo shafchu et hadam hazeh? The following did not happen. It did not happen that he was bali adenu, that we saw this passerby, upitarnuhu below mizonot, and we sent him on his way without food. That did not happen. So, if you flip it around, right? What would make us responsible for the death of this person? Had we seen this person and sent him on his way without food, and I think that we're supposed to imagine kind of the traveler who's coming through town alone, or that traveler. And I'll ask you already, or not, maybe a homeless type, maybe a vagrant, wander, maybe not. People traveled a lot. I mean, I will bring to mind, because it's going to come back again, this week's Parsha. This is Parsha Shavua of Abraham. God appears to Avram after his Brit Milah, and then three angels, travelers, Malachim, are traveling, and Abraham's response is, he says to God, hold on 1 second, I'll be right back, and he goes and takes care of the people who are traveling. That's exactly the scenario that we're talking about. And we'll see that the Rambam's going to make that connection in a real way. So what this first statement says is, we didn't see him and let him go without food. Second, lo ri'inuhu, what didn't we see? So when you see lo Einenu lo ra'u. So, pshat in the pasuk, when they say Yadenu lo shavchu et hadam hazeh, pshat is we didn't kill the person. Einenu lo ra'u, pshat is we didn't see who killed the person. I think that's kind of we don't know what happened. Lo shavchu does Einenu lo ra'u. Gemara doesn't. The Mishnah Chazal doesn't interpret it that way. Yadenu lo shavchu et hadam hazeh. We did not ignore this person. Ve'einenu lo ra'u. Gemara says lo ri'inuhu. We did not see him. V'hinachnuhu below levaya, and then leave him below levaya without escort. So now, what is the Gemara then saying? In other words, what does the statement mean when Beis Din says Yadeinu lo shafchu et hadam hazeh ve'einenu lo ra'u? Well, it's actually interesting. I mean, what can you translate that into a normal sentence? What are they saying? They're saying Yadeinu lo shafchu et hadam hazeh ve'einenu lo ra'u. According to this, what's their proclamation?
We didn't do anything wrong.
Why didn't we do anything? What would have been wrong?
They didn't give food and they left.
It would have been wrong for us to see. It would have been wrong for us to see him, and not provide for him. So why are we innocent?
Because we didn't see him.
We didn't see him.
But does that mean that the real murderer is exculpated?
So no, they have to find the murderer. Some of the Rishonim, I want to make sure that we're not focused. I want to shift our attention away from the murderer. Some people explain that the reason why they have this whole public ceremony in this way is because it's going to get people talking, and that's going to help them find the culprit, because this way you'll have word of mouth. But I want to make sure that we're shifting our focus. Our interest here is not in how do we catch this murderer. And I actually think that there's a big lesson that Eglah Rufat teaches that gets lost in discussing how do we catch the murder. What does Eglah Rufat have to do with the murder? That's not the point of this statement. Why did the Beis Din have to show up and make this declaration? What are they saying?
Because they didn't see him. Why did they see him?
Why didn't they see him? In other words, there's actually a really powerful double entendre. I mean, a double meaning. It's not double entendre. It's kind of a double meaning in the sentence. What did they? They're bringing a carbon, right? They bring a carbon, and the carbon smacks of guilt. And what do they say when they bring the carbon?
They're saying we should have seen him and we didn't set up institutions that would have caught him.
Kind of the genius of the formulation is the same sentence is both a statement of guilt and a statement of innocence. Because what do they say when they say we did not see him and send him off without anything? What they're saying is
He was
we didn't see him
invisible.
and send him off without anything. We're innocent, and we didn't see him and send him off. We didn't see him and send him off without anything. We're also guilty. We didn't see him. Both of those things are true, and I think that that's like a very powerful. The story of the Eglah Rufah is a story of the half guilt and the half innocence of the Ziknei Beit Din who have a. Why is it that the city takes responsibility for this, and it's the city that's closest? The city that's closest because I don't know which city you're going to pick. So you measure and you pick the city that's closest. Why is it the city? Why is it the Beit Din? There's a real social justice principle down here that hidden in here that the Rambam is actually going to expand on, which is if you have a city where people walk through and they don't get noticed and they die, you have responsibility for it. Are you guilty? Not exactly. Are you innocent? Not exactly either. And that's the story of the Eglah Rufah. That's the message that it's teaching. If you look at the next line of the Gemara says, Tanya Harabi Meir Omer, Meir used to say, Kofin Lil Vaya. Kofin Lil Vaya. This is an odd, you know what kofeh means from last week. To be kofeh means to force. So, Kofin Lil Vaya. Well, look at the line before in the Breita. What do you have to do when somebody's passing through the town? You got to provide for them. In what forms? You got to get them food. You'll also have to provide them a place to stay if they need it, but you're also going to have to provide them with. Levaya means accompaniment. Now we're going to have to use our imagination to apply it today to what exactly that means. But levaya means this is about like security, just feeling like people know who you are. I meant to and then I didn't, but I'm just going to say out loud. The Gemara talks about like how do you know? It says kofin levaya. You have an obligation to force people. Now remember what it meant last week. What does it mean when it says force? What's the idea of force? that means that the authorities, there's some things that are moral virtues. But if it's kofin, it is a moral virtue that the Beit Din, that the town, the city, has the right to force you to do. So they can force, you're supposed to force accompaniment, because the schar of accompaniment has no shi'ur. And the Gemara tells the story of Elisha. I'm going to kind of get into all that. Elisha was walking by himself. He was in a city and he left traveling by himself. And there were some kids playing around, and the kids were playing around there. They saw Elisha and they started calling him Kereach, Kereach, you're the bald guy. Elisha turned and gave him the evil eye, and people died. It was a disaster. And the bears came, correct. The bears came and ate, very good. The bears came and ate, that's the story. The Gemara says, you know what that's a story, you know what that proves? Even Elisha, that never would have happened. The reason why I like that example is because it's Elisha, and like kids. And it's not even exactly a murder, it's just one of those things as a principal of a school where there are like lots of kids and people do, that if you leave, sometimes you leave people by themselves, like good kids know, stuff happens, right? If you're just there, less stuff happens because you're there. So this is exactly an example. Nobody was out to mug Elisha, nobody was out to rip, that's not what the story was. It was so, kids playing, gave an evil eye, and the Gemara says, that's the proof that you need, if you don't have Levaya, the Gemara says, Hareza, sorry I didn't put it on, the Gemara says, Kofin Levaya is the first half, the Gemara later on says, if you do not have Levaya, right, if you don't provide Levaya, Hareza Shofech Damim. That's considered murders. What's the idea here again? So hyperbole, right? If you wanted to look at it as hyperbole, it's like, that's really important. It's saying much more than that, I think. It's saying you have to have a place which is going to provide these kinds of things, because this is the way society works. It's like and I think it's an easy transition into like, as law enforcement, cops on the street, like building relationships with people who know they are as law enforcement. They're like shitos of law enforcement, right? But so the idea of Levaya is that. I mean, it's easy to talk about like, police officers being around and present, not about arresting people, but about being on the beat, that kind of thing. That's a little bit of what's at stake here. So what I wanted to, that's the first thing. So the first thing is, there is a principle that derives from Eglah Arufah that is saying you have an obligation to provide for people, and the example of the people we're talking about are not our own citizens, Kal V'chomer. We're talking about the guy passing through. You have an obligation to do that. Outcome, like the first piece. Comment? Okay.
Does it apply if the person isn't actually murdered, but it just dies without suspicious cause?
I think that the idea here is that you don't know what happened, and so you apply this ritual to every circumstance. Mm-hmm. The assumption in the Gemara seems to be that it's a murder, and they're trying to figure out who caused it to happen. Who caused it? I mean, and that's
by
part
giving
of
food. If he's starving and you give him food, then he won't starve and won't die at that point.
Correct. Right. On the other hand, right. Right. You're right. Right. I think that's precisely. I think a little. Those things don't. In our minds, they get separated out in like the lives of cities. When I use my I kind of imagine it. Those aren't so separate. Like if you're living under a bridge and people are providing for you, you die from starvation, you get killed. It's not so neat. I think that's how I think about the point a little bit in that kind of way. So I'd like to do that is now shift gears. This is like a first piece, and now I'm not doing Gemara anymore, but I want to kind of suggest, I've been paying attention, reading some of the Rambams here. The Rambam formulates, takes this halacha, the way that it compares with some of the things that we've done in the past. So I want to try to develop a little bit in the Rambam. Now the Rambam, this idea of kofin lilvaya, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't paskin it. If you think about it, it's like, what does it mean to be kofel lilvaya? And I want to stress the fact that there's this line in the Gemara that says you're supposed to force accompaniment. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't quote it. The Rambam does quote it. Not only does he quote it, he makes something out of it. So I want to look at kind of where it says letter bet. We're going to start reading a bunch of Rambams. And this is a Rambam, again, in Hilchot Avel, Perek Yudal, Halachot Aleph to Gimel. To understand what's going on in this Rambam, I'm going to start with Halachot Gimel. You see where that is? It's see where it says Gimel, Kofin Lilvaya. So here's how the Rambam paskins it, and his language is very provocative, like it's precise. Kofin l'levaya, kederech shekofin l'tzedakah. What does this have to do with that? Kofin, we learned last week, we read a Rambam last week that says that the Beit Din enforces tzedakah. That means that the town can assess and collect. And they have the right to do that. What is Kofin l'levaya? And the Rambam, again, I'm just saying again, Shulchan Aruch doesn't paskin this statement of the Gemara. The Rambam paskin the statement of the Gemara. Not only does he paskin the statement, does he rule it, but he draws this line. What's the Vaya and Stakah have to do with each other? What's the Rambam after?
Everybody's responsible.
So there's something that the Rambam, I think, is trying to develop, which has to do with people being responsible for each other. You know, the town is responsible. Kofin means the authorities. Where do you get the Kofin authorities here? The Ziknei Beit Din do the Eglah Rufa. They're responsible for this thing. So I'm saying there's a financial obligation, there's an accompaniment of obligation. These things actually come together. So you have to be Kofin. Now, and he says, Ubeit Din hayu metaknin shluchim l'lavot adam ha'overi makom l'makom. And the Beit Din was supposed to establish people who are going to provide, escort accompaniment from place to place. I can't imagine exactly what this looks like. And if they are they're lazy, slothful around that. If you don't provide that, it's as though you murdered. I'm just quoting the Gemara. That's what the Gemara says. But we have a sense of what the Gemara means. It doesn't mean that you're the murderer. It means that as a town, you have responsibility, and if the city doesn't take care of its citizens, that results in death, you are responsible for, that's your job. That's what you have to make sure doesn't happen. If it does happen, he doesn't say you are a murderer, it's ki'ilu shafchu damim, but that is kind of the immediate, what he draws out of Eglah Rufa. Now, this is in Hilchos Avel. I want to go back for a second to let's see. I want to go back for a second to Halacha Aleph. So maybe in order to do this properly, we should do a little bit of take a step back to organize ourselves around the Rambam. So the Rambam wrote the Mishnah Torah. Okay, how many books in the Mishnah Torah? 14 books. Shmona Prakim is something else. Those are the 8 chapters that he wrote as an introduction to Pirkei Avot. That's an ethical introduction. Ram wrote Mishnah Torah was a compilation, basically the first time that was ever done, compiling all the halakha from Torah Sheba'al Peh in an organized fashion, and it was divided into 14 Sfarim. Examples of the 14 Sfarim, just so you can get kind of into that zone of how the Rambam divided things up. Anybody have a sense of what some of the books are? Avel is a subcategory of a larger category. Some of the larger categories, an accessible example is Zmanim. That's a book. Okay, so what's in Zmanim? Shabbos, Yonte, right? All the Chametz Umatzah, Lulav, Sukkah, Purim. That's in Zmanim. That's all. That's there. Nezikin. So Nezikin is damages. That's all tort laws, right? It's all chovel between people, between property. That's it. Ahava.
That's what Pirkei Avot is.
It's in Nezikin, and why it is, it's his own discussion.
Avot are torts.
Yes, right. One of the main Arba Avos Nezikin. Is that right? What Zra'im has to do with all the agricultural mitzvot, things have to do with that. Ahava is tzitzis, tefillah, brachos, things that you connect with God, things like that. Okay. The last of the 14 Svarim in the Rambam is called Shoftim. So what does Shoftim have to do with? Shofet is the judge. So if you look at the next, I'm not going back, I'm going forwards. That's the next to last source on the page. What the Rambam did before you read anything is that the Rambam, in his introduction, before he started writing any of the halachot, he basically listed the 14 books, and then the subcategories of each of the 14 books. So if you take the example we just did, so if you pick Zmanim, So the Rambam would say Sefer Zmanim. What's in Sefer Zmanim? Explains all the Zman-related kinds of laws, and he'll list them each in order. Hilchot Shabbat, Hilchot Yom Tov, Hilchot Shvitat Asor, Hilchot Chametz Umatzah. So you go through the list. So if it's like that, so Hilchos Avel is a subcategory of a larger category. Hilchot Tfilah is a subcategory of Ahava. So we are now, the last book is Shoftim. What do you think is in Shoftim? You're talking about courts. So look at the list, which is the next to last line. And I want to explain to you again what you're reading. This is when the Ram says Sefer Shoftim, and then he just lists the categories. What's the first book in Sefer Shoftim? Hilchot Sanhedrin, v'ha'onchin ha'mesurim lahem. So what's the first set of laws?
4.
Sanhedrin. That makes sense. Why Sanhedrin and Shoftim? That's what they are. Sanhedrin are the Shoftim. And they have to punish, so it's Sanhedrin, and they're kind of retributive justice, so whatever that is, yes. Hilchot Eidut. How about that? Eidut? Makes sense? Why is Hilchos Eidus there? Hilchos Eidus, Sanhedrin, Shoftim, makes sense. Mamrim. Hilchot Mamrim is somebody who rejects the authority of the Beit Din and says you're wrong, and then he pleads his, the base category of Hilchos Mamrim is a rabbi, let's say, a dayan who says the Beit Din is wrong. He can come and make his claim for a Beit Din, he made a mistake. If the Beit Din says, sorry, we disagree, they can say, oh, you're right, we made a mistake. They say, no, we think you're wrong. If he continues on his path, that's Hilchos Mamrim. That's a big problem. He becomes a Zakei Mamrim. I'm going to skip the next one so you can look at the last one, which is Hilchos Melachim u'Milchamoteim. Hilchos Melachim. So far, right, all those are good, right? Sanhedrin, Eidus, Mamrim, Melachim, Hilchos Melachim, and then what's right there, right before that?
Avel.
Hilchos Avel. What does that have to do with this? Why is Hilchos Avel here? So a big question that everybody asks on the Rambam's organization. The Rambam was meticulous, like astonishingly meticulous in where he put everything. Why on earth did the Rambam put Hilchos Avel in the middle of Sefer Shoftim?
Because you just killed somebody.
So the Rambam says, read the next thing. So the Rambam, he goes, when he talks about Hilchos Avel, he says, Yesh bichlalan arba mitzvot. He also lists all the mitzvot that are in each sefer. He says there are 4 mitzvot in the Hilchos Avel. Achat mitzvah aseh, shalosh mitzvot lo taseh. There's 1 positive commandment, 3 negative commandments. Zeu pratan. These are their specifics. Hilchos Avel hitabel al akrovim. The mitzvah aseh Avel is to be mitabel for people who pass away. Afilu kohen mitamei mitabel al akrovim. Even kohanim are supposed to do that. Ve'ein adam mitabel al harugei beit din. But you're not misabel, that's halacha. If somebody's convicted of a capital crime and put to death, you don't sit shiva for that person. There's no abelos for that person. And the Rambam says, "V'fiza kalalti alachot elu b'sefer zeh shehein me'in kfura b'yom mitash mitzaseh." Why did the Rambam put Hilchos Avel here? Why did the Rambam put Hilchos Avel here? Because we're talking about Hilchos Sanhedrin and Eidus, so that's why. Now, so you'll say, "Oh, that's a cheery thought." Is that what Avelos is about? Is that really that's what Avelos is about? But
How often does that happen?
how often does that happen? So you could say that the Rambam is stam, but he's not. So Moshe Halbertal has a talk where he explains something very sharp about the Rambam, which is really reflecting a big machlokas we showed him, and this is kind of a tangent that's going to bring us back to where we're supposed to be. But the Rambam, what's the purpose of Avelos? So it is common today to think about Avelos as being a tremendous psychologically insightful thing for the mourner.
Healing.
It's a healing process. Right, so that's right, and I don't have to go into the details as to why that is, but you're socially set off, and then you have time, the people come in comfort, and then you slowly make your way back in. What Moshe Halbertal says, and I think I totally believe that, and it's in the Rishon already have a machlokas about is Avelos kavod chaim or kavod mesim. What does that mean? Is the idea of avelus because you're paying respect to the person who's now in avelus and suffering? Or is the idea of avelus that you're paying respect to the person who passed away? Now once you frame the question like that, I assume most people say, it's both, right? It's both. So there certainly are aspects of both. Once you start thinking like that, then you say, no, what the Rambam is actually pointing to in putting the halachot here is a heavy emphasis in one arena. You know why you don't sit Shiva for, what's the idea of avelus? So the idea of avelus is that you have to, if somebody passes from your community, you have to notice. You have an obligation, you have to notice. Did I copy this Rambam? Look at this on the next slide, on the Halach Yidal. This is also top of page 2. This is a quote from the Gemara, just a direct quote from the Gemara. So the Rambam is just quoting it, but again, I think it's halacha that gets lost. But it says, Meis echad be'ir. If somebody passes away in the city, who's obligated to bury? Kol b'nei ha'ir asurim b'asiyat malacha ad sheikberu. That is an astonishing halacha that we don't pay attention to. The halacha is who is obligated to stop work and go to the funeral? Everybody. The whole city is obligated. That's incredible. Now, the Gemara quotes that as halacha, and as the Gemara's way, they quote a halacha, and then they quote a story. The story they quote afterwards, Rav, I don't remember who it was passing through the town, and somebody passed away, and everybody's at work. And he said, you're all in chayrim. I said, why are you all in chayrim? He said, somebody passed away, how can you go to work? He says, we have a chevra. So he said, okay, if you have a chevra, then you're potter. That's the story after the Gemara, which the Rambam paskins. Im yesh lo mishi yitasek b'tzrachav mutarin. If you have somebody who's taking care of it, then it's okay. Now, I want to note, because I find this in the Gemara. The Gemara quotes a halacha, and then it quotes a story. It's important that it quotes the halacha, and it quotes a story, because what it's telling you when it quotes a halacha and it quotes a story is, what's the halacha? Don't let the narrative of the way that it plays out make you lose sight of, like, is it possible that every time there's a funeral here in the city, everybody's going to stop work and go to the funeral? It's not possible. What's the halacha? That's the halacha. Why don't you do it? We have a chevra, so it takes care of it. But don't forget what the halacha is. The problem is we have forgotten what the halacha is. It's not a question.
For us, it's not a city, it's a community.
Whatever you do. Yeah, however you slice it, it's the same thing as true. Parts of the community stop for parts, right? Everybody goes to the things that they go to, and that's, and kol kavod, right? That's not the, but the beauty of when the Gemara, I think it's like B'dafka, that the Gemara quotes a halacha and a story, because what it's saying is, it's not a question of this is the halacha. I know that life's not going to function exactly this way, so you have to, in your mind, say, we're actually supposed to stop, but we can't, so this is what we're doing instead. Now, why is this so important? Go backwards. What's the idea of what is the idea of avelus that is emphasized in this setting that we lose because of our psychologically minded, and that's a great thing. There's a whole other side. The Rambam actually prioritizes in his ordering the thing. Avelus is not first and foremost about my mental health. Avelus is first and foremost about the communities recognizing that somebody passed away and you have to stop. That's why there's halacha, the Rambam paskins. What happens if somebody passes away and there are no avelim? 10 people have to sit in that person's house. That's what the Gemara says. It's machlokes Rishonim about how to interpret that Gemara. Other Rishonim interpret it differently than the Rambam does, but the Rambam's interpretation is 10 people have to go to that house and sit. Why? Other Rishonim actually say, the way the other Rishonim interpret it is they say, one person sits as a make-believe avel, and then 10 people come because you have to, what are these? No, 10 people come and they sit there. Why are the 10 people, what are they sitting? Shit, I'm not an avel. You are an avel. We are all avel for the person who passed away. Now, it is not by chance then that if you go back, the Rambam does something very odd in Hilchos Avel Perek Yudal Halacha. Again, we'll go back to the middle of the page, where the Rambam, again, this is rooted in, it's only meaningful if you're focused on the organizational, genius, I guess, of the Rambam, and not just the facts. Because we're going to read a halacha, and you're going to say this is like apple pie. We all know this stuff. The Rambam put it here, and in Hilchos Avel, there are 14 chapters in Hilchos Avel. He's gone through all the halachas in Hilchos Avel. Last chapter, he says like this: Mitzvah saseh shel divreihim levaker cholim lenachrim avelim lahotzi hameis lachnis hakala lelavot orchim litasek b'chol tzorchei hakvura. Let's stop there for a second. The Ram is actually now listing. He picks here to list all those lovely mitzvot. What are they? Bikur cholim, right? Chesed. Nichem avelim, chesed. Lotzi hamet, lachnis hakala, to marry, right? To be mesameach chesed hakala. Lelavot ha'orchim, to escort the visit, your guest. Litasek b'chol tzorchei hakvura. He goes back now to the burial. Laseit al hakatef, to carry the mate. Leilech lepanav, l'spo lachbor l'kbor, to do the kvura. L'sameach chesed hakala. The earlier one was to pay for the wedding. This is to dance at the wedding. L'sa'adam b'chol tzorcheihem, make sure the food is good. Eilohen gemilut chasadim shebegufo she'ein lahem shi'ur. This is gemilut chasadim shebegufo. Now you know, hopefully not right, you can recognize what's Rambam mean when he says gemilut chasadim shebegufo. What is gemilut chasadim? It's begufo, as opposed to staka that's bimono. Gemilut chasadim is begufo. That's what he's talking. This is what's the Rambam doing here? When he talks about the mitzvah of, he chose this Hilchos Avel for him to kind of sum up. He had lots of places along the way where he could talk about all these mitzvahs of Bein Adam Lachaver Gemilut Chasad. He chose to put it over here, and then he says, "Afal pishakom etzot el midivreihem." Even though these are all drabanan, there's no explicit pasuk in the Torah that talks about Bikur Cholim. There's a medrash from God visiting Avraham. There's no explicit mitzvah for Achnas Asorchim. There's no explicit mitzvah for the Lavot et Hamet. Harehi b'chlal v'haftarecha kamocha. This is a definition of the Rambam that's very important to know. He made it up. V'haftarecha kamocha. How do you do that? So the Rambam's answer is all those chesed mitzvot. That's v'haftarecha kamocha. That's how you fulfill them. Kol advarim she'ata rotzeh she'yasu otam l'cha acherim, haseh ata otam la'achicha b'torav mitzvot. Everything that you like other people to do for you, you should do for them. Now, this is not about if you like stuff, get other people's. This is chesed. You should do chesed. That's a kiyum v'haftarecha kamocha. All that is background to the next line, which is now going to kind of get us in the order. Schar halavaya miruba min hakol. There's a certain irony here for us. What does levaya mean? When we talk about a levaya, what are we talking about? Funeral. We're talking about a funeral, right? I don't think it's stam that there is that. The kofin levaya that the Gemara is talking about is, do you remember that? In our Gemara, levayat who? The living, not levayat the dead. The Rambam here is actually talking about levayat living. He's also talking about levayat living. But it's in the context of Avelis, and it's like there are lines that are being blurred here a little bit. And this is what he says: Schar levaya merubah min hakol. Out of all of the forms of tzedakah, chesed, out of all of the forms of chesed, what is the highest form of chesed?
Being there.
Accompaniment.
Being there.
Which is being there with the other person. That's the highest form of chesed. And now look at this. Vehu achok shechakako Avraham Avinu. This idea of levaya, that has been established as law from Avram Avinu. I don't know, and I have not researched this, but I don't know who else has made as big a deal and conceptualized this in this way other than the Rambam. The Rambam is like taking a story and a line of Gemara, and he has lifted it up and formulated it in a certain kind of way. This is where do you see that that's the chok of Avram Avinu? It's funny because I've been talking about this to peers. You say like, what do you know about Avram Avinu and his chesed? Achras Asorchim, this week's parsha, right? You know that, yeah. And then I say like, well, Rambam says this is the biggest thing, and we like scratched our heads for a second, saying, did he escort them? Because you're like so focused on doing the story. But actually, at the end of the story, first stone it says, right, Avraham holech imam v'shalcha. Avraham went with them to send them off, and that's when the stone thing happened. Isn't it interesting? Do I have that right?
Why would the Malachim go into Sodom?
Well, there's an interesting, once you talk about cities and watching and pray, wondering about just, there's a connection there too, that if you're with the people, you see what's wrong and you're able to kind of do something about it. There's something going on there. And then he says, let's read a little bit more. V'derech hachesed shenahagba. This is a manifestation of his chesed. What would Avram do? Ma'achil ovrei drachim, mashke otan, u'melaveh otan. He would give them to eat, to drink, and escort them. And then the Rambam says, this is like the beauty of the Rambam. He plucks that medrash and puts it in here, where the medrash describes that when Avram was sitting with God in front of him, visit, right, Vayirah Elav Hashem, so he then goes to be machnis oreach, and that shows God's in front of you. You can say, God, wait 1 second, I'm going to do this. That's crazy. No, that's the lesson. So you think that's the lesson. Rambam says, no, you forgot another Gemara. There's a bigger lesson. And then he says, "V'livuyam yoter me'achnasatam," and accompanying them on the way out is even bigger than the achnasat rechim. Amru chachamim kol she'eino melaveh kilu shofech damim. If you're not melaveh the person, it's as though you are murdering the person. So now, here's what I'm trying to claim. Like, what's the Rambam? What's kind of going on here? The Rambam takes this idea of being melaveh, the chai, incorporates it into this Hilchos Avelos for whatever reason, and then says you're this is like a big deal. It's like the biggest of all the things. Now, once you start thinking about that, you realize as follows. Okay, why are you kofeh on chesed? You force somebody to be mvakir cholim. Let's go back. Are you kofeh on staka?
Yeah.
Are you kofeh on levaya? Gemara said you're kofeh on levaya. Yes. Gemara said you are. Are you kofeh? Are you kofeh on achnasas kala? No. Are you kofeh on bikur cholim? No. Are you kofeh on this? You're kofeh on stuff. And then the Rambam says, no chagimel. Kofin levaya kider shekofin l'tzedakah. Now, what is that? This is the next question, right? Until now, I don't know, you like bouncing too many places at one time. What have you been trying to do so far? The first part was to say that from the Eglah Rufa to recognize what's the Parshat Eglah Rufa about. Parshat Eglah Rufa is about if you don't recognize, feel the responsibility to recognize each individuals in your world, you're going to be responsible for their death. Which basically means you got to build cities that are going to take care of people so it doesn't happen. The Rambam, I think, is taking those Gemaras and making that into a much larger principle, by way of saying that Levaya is bigger. That's the biggest thing what Avraham Avinu made. I mean, I guess the takeaways I'd like for you to have from here are 3 from this whole little chunk. 1, when we're in Hilchos Avelos, we're talking about communal responsibilities, and you see that from its context and the things that it's talking about. Number 1. Number 2, you see that the Rambam makes Levaya the biggest of the Chesed things. That's the biggest thing he makes. Number 2. Number 3. He equates Levaya and Staka in that you are kofeh on both of those things, which means he makes it even bigger than all of those other things. So what you then get is our responsibility. We're supposed to be nice people and do a lot of chesed and do a lot of tzedakah. Our communal responsibilities, the Rambam has enumerated 2 basic things: tzedakah, levaya. Those are the 2 things. The question that I'd like to ask is, why those 2 things and what does it mean? So if you turn the page for a second, I want to read a little bit about how Rambam describes in Mar Nevuchim. Book 3, chapter 53 in Mar Nevuchim is the next to last chapter in the book. That's a big thing. I mean, it's like he's been working for hundreds of pages, and this is really pretty much the end, and at the end he's going to continue on the themes here. So this is the English part. Page 2. Yes, we got it. Page 2, God perplexed. The Rambam is asking in this chapter, his question is, this chapter treats of the meaning of 3 terms which we find necessary to explain: chesed, mishpat, and staka. On our topic. The Rambam is saying, what's the difference between these 3 terms, chesed, mishpat, and staka? I'll say Meirosh that the Rambam does not have a mishpat and staka and deities like we talked about 2 weeks ago. The Rambam sees all these 3 things as 3 different things. The Rambam says, I'm going to focus on chesed and staka. As I said, chesed and staka. And this, by the way, is the staka in the biblical, like when the Torah talks about mishpat and staka, what's the staka that it's talking about? So he says like this: in our commentary on the sayings of the fathers, Pirkei Avos, we have explained the expression chesed as denoting an excess. Chesed, it is true, is excess. That's why famously, you can, the Torah calls a sexual sin
Also
chesed too.
Oiva.
Yeah, so because, what you mean, that can mean excess, that's,
Chesed is a,
there are
It's
there
a-
are things that are categorized as toevot that are chesed
yeah,
because
so
they
that's why
are,
we say chasadim tovim.
yes, right, good. Because chesed on its own means excess. When we talk about chesed in the good sense, we're talking about an excess in moral virtue. That's what the Rambam says, an excess in moral virtue. It is especially used of extraordinary kindness. Loving kindness is practiced in two ways. First, we show kindness to those who have no claim whatsoever upon us. I find this fascinating to the Rambam. Because what does it mean to do chesed? Do chesed means to do something do something for somebody where there's no claim, there's a moral claim, there's no obligatory claim on you to do it, and you do it anyway. That's the definition of chesed.
Recognize somebody for being human.
Yes, but hold that so we can distinguish between that and staka, yeah. Secondly, we're kind to those to whom it is due in a greater measure than is due to them. Meaning, it might be right to do, you can do a chesed, you can like bring somebody into your home, or you can bring somebody into your home, right? So, I mean, I'll read the last sentence and then say it. In the inspired writings, the term chesed occurs mostly in the sense of showing kindness to those who have no claim to it whatever. Okay, let's stop for a second, think about this. What's the definition of chesed? What's the Rambam's definition of chesed? Excess. What does it mean when it's doing gemilut chesed? Excess. Why is it excess? Going above and beyond in the sense that there's no claim. Right? No claim. What's tzedakah then? And we're using these terms in different ways in different settings, and I'm sorry for that, but that's just kind of true. When we talk, well, that's a little bit, well, to what? Right.
Not
That's
to be visiting when you're sick, just to be hurry.
But that's part of dignity, and I know we started by saying that that's the point, that everybody has, that's our starting point.
so hold it and test it. I mean, you're right to hold on to that question. I think we got to read a little bit more and then see what comes out of it. But the term, yeah, I mean, I'll only say, right, but yeah, let's go on with it. The term tzedakah is derived from tzedek. The Torah talks about tzedakah, that's the same word as tzedek. It denotes the act of giving everyone his due and of showing kindness to every being according as it deserves. In Scripture, however, the expression tzedakah is not used in the first sense. He'll explain it. It doesn't apply to the payment of what we owe to others. If you owe somebody money, is that tzedakah, and you pay, is that tzedakah? No. If somebody works for you and you pay their salary, is that tzedakah? No. When we therefore give the hired laborer his wages or pay a debt, we do not perform an act of tzedakah, right? That makes sense.
But we give it to him
But
before the evening.
Well, that's your responsibility. If you don't give it to him before the evening, then you violate a lo taseh. That's not above, that's exactly what it means that's not above, yeah, that's your obligation. We do perform an act of tzedakah when we fulfill those duties towards our fellow men, which our moral conscience imposes upon us, when we heal the wound of the sufferer. Okay, let's think about this for a second. I think I'm going to ask the following three things. There's chesed, there's tzedakah, and then there's what you're supposed to do. What is chesed? Chesed is somebody has no obligation upon you. Somebody has no claim upon you, but you do it anyway. What's tzedakah? There's a claim on you because it's the right thing to do.
Tzaddak.
What's the example of that? So the Rambam gives an example of that. We mentioned it last week. If I lend somebody money and I take his mashkon, what am I supposed to do with the mashkon if the person needs it?
Return it.
I'm supposed to give it back to him. Now, it's not chesed. Why is it not chesed? The Torah calls that tzedakah. Why is that not chesed? Because Torah tells you you're supposed to do it. But why is it not the law that you're supposed to? Why is it not like expected of you to do that? If I borrowed money, I lent you money and I have the mashkon, why should I have to give you back the? It's almost like this. The definition of chesed is doing things for people when they have no claim on you, because you feel like it's like the right thing to do. And tzedakah is doing things that is not required of you by law, where there is a moral virtue to do that thing, such that the person actually has a claim on you. Now you'll say, what is that? And I will say to you that the Rambam says there are two things that are in that category. What is the difference between what you're kofeh and what you're not kofeh? What's the definition of kofeh? That the authorities have to make sure that this happens. So I'm going to kind of submit that if you go back to the halachos, and you can turn or not turn, I don't know, whatever it is, in Hilchos Avel, this is what's going on here. What's Hilchos Avel about? Recognizing the dignity if somebody passes away, right? And we are recognizing that there's like loss in that. What are you supposed to learn from that? That you should recognize that actually before the person passes away. You have to recognize like the value of the person. Where do you show that? You show that by doing tzedakah and chesed. What are the categories of tzedakah and chesed? Well, there are lots of things like chesed that are bikur cholim, where you go above and beyond, that's excess. Nobody can force me to do that. Meaning, I should be mevaker cholim. It's a mitzvah to be mevaker cholim. If we have a society of people who are mevaker cholim, then that's great and wonderful. But the society cannot function without certain aspects of tzedakah, and those tzedakah things are levaya and tzedakah, financial support, and recognizing the dignity of the person, being able to provide for that person on a regular kind of basis. So what the Rambam is essentially doing is, at the end of Hilchos Avel, he says, what we have to do is make sure they're doing lots of chesed. That is the derech shechakako Avram Avinu. That's what Avram Avinu taught us. And its manifestation is in levaya, in the dignity of people. I think that maybe that's a mouthful. I'm going to stick. Can we take some time for clarifying questions for a second?
You talk about the Rambam and the accompaniment of the individual as the Milas Chesed. The Mishnah goes specific, talks about levayas hames. It's accompanying the dead person.
So yeah.
It's a very different.
It is a very different, but that's why I'm noting two things, and I'm going to use that as a segue for a second. Two things. First of all, the Gemara in Sota that talks about the kofin levaya, that the person died in the Eglah Rufa case because nobody escorted him. From there you learn you have an obligation to escort, and that Avram Avinu escorted the angels. The Gemara uses the word levaya in that instance, and it's using the word levaya about escorting the living.
But it doesn't use the term Milas Chesed.
Well, there's a category. There's a category, levaya, and the Rambam says that the category of if you look at the kind of the list of things that are in the Rambam of Milas Chesed, levaya is in that list. In the first line of Halach Aleph, it says, "Mitzvah sasei shel beil vaker cholim achim avelon tziyameit v'achnis kala u'lavot ha'orchim." That's escorting the living.
But that's mitzvah. That's not Milas Chesed.
No, that's what he says at the end. Elohein gemilut chasadim shebegufo she'ein lehem shiur. That's the fourth line.
Okay.
So what I'm trying to, can we ask clarifying? Clarifying anything? I just want to try to make sure that this is clear. Yeah.
I'm trying to understand what the difference of what tzedakah is. If tzedakah is the law, like it's the law that you have to return the mashkon. So are you saying that tzedakah is only the law and it's only legislated to help other people, and that's not how business deals would generally have to be transacted?
Something like that.
That's why it's part of the law,
Yeah.
not that you're going above the law.
Yeah. So some of those, there are two examples. There are two different kinds of examples. I'll say that have to do with loans. The Torah says that if you return a mashkon to the person who borrowed money, it says ulchati tzedakah. That's what the Torah calls it. So on the one hand, that's the law. The Torah said you have to do it. On the other hand, the Torah says that's called tzedakah. So what does it mean by that? It means that what distinguishes Judaism is, this is I think a distinctive characteristic, in that it's legislating this kind of moral virtue that you have to do because it's the right thing. Now and so much so that, but not every moral virtue is it a legal obligation, they force you to do it. Bikur cholim is a different kind of thing. You can make a choice about whether you can vakir cholim or not. But there are others which they force. How do they make that distinction? So it seems to me like what the Rambam is pushing for is the distinction is things that make society run. It's like, kind of the capital, loans are a big deal. Like the society functions on a basis. So the Torah has a very significant focus on lending money. You should, if somebody comes to you, you should lend money. Even if you're not sure you're going to get it back, you should lend money. Why? Because that's one of the sources. Okay, you ready? I guess this is the last thing that I was going to do. I'm going to make the point a little bit more orally, so I don't get too bogged down in the text. But let's go to page 3 for a second. It's kind of interesting. The Rambam has 8 levels of charity. Rambam famously has 8 levels of charity. A lot of the higher levels have to do with anonymity. So if the giver doesn't know who you are, but the taker does, or the taker doesn't know who you are, but the giver does, those are in higher levels. What is the highest level of charity according to the Rambam? Which is another shir, which is another kind of genius. Rambam plucked the Gemara from someplace else and plopped this on the top. And he counts this as one of the mitzvahs d'oraisa, the highest level of charity.
You don't know who you're giving to, and they don't know who they're receiving.
That's the next to highest level. The highest level is a job. Well, the Rambam formulates that as a loan. But it's the same idea, a loan. Loan's not charity, and the Torah loan is charity. If you actually put all the concepts together, you have to lend the money, you have to give him back the mashkon, you're not allowed to charge you interest, you're not allowed. What's the idea of a biblical loan? Biblical loan is verzachtabo. It's supposed to help somebody get on their feet. That's the idea of a loan. Now, if you look at the page, I'm not going to read it, but the second source is Sefer Mitzvahs Rambam, or where the Rambam basically says the idea of tzedakah is to strengthen the weak. If you look at Kuf Tzadi Hey, shetzivanu lasot tzedakah lechazek hachalashim, to strengthen the weak. And if you look at Kuf Tzadi Zayin, hu shetzivanu lehalvot la'ani. What are you supposed to do for a poor person? Lend him money. This is the Rambam's mitzvah of tzedakah, to lend him money. Now, so I checked to make sure that this was actually right, but the word halva'ah, what's the root of that word, halva'ah? The root of halva'ah and livaya, that's the same word. It comes from the same shorish. And I think that there's something very important in that. Because what is the idea of halva'ah? It is to, backwards. We think, what's halva'ah loan? Let's go backwards. No, what is livaya? Accompaniment, being there for the person. So what does being there for the person mean? Well, you can be there for the person physically, or what does being there for the person mean? If the person's down and out, he's in need, you give him that. We're going to talk next week about the word charity has a totally different, the whole caritas business has a very different orientation than this orientation. The idea of tzedakah as stemming from tzedek, which is connected to levaya, connected to halva'ah, has a whole worldview that is contained within it, which is about being present for the other person when the other person needs it, when the other person is weak or down and out. And that means recognizing the other person's need and being able to step up on the person's behalf. There are 2 ways in which that plays out. There's the chesed way, and that's doing stuff that you don't have to do, you just want to do it because that's, and then there's the tzedakah way, which is, it's not stemming from chesed and excess, it's stemming from tzedek, righteousness, meaning you have an obligation to be there for the other person. So tzedakah means it's a righteous act that you have to do because it's the morally correct thing to do. What is that act? Livaya hava'ah, which means being present for that person in that kind of setting. Now, therefore, livaya and halva'ah are the 2 examples. Therefore, kofin lilivaya in the same way that you're kofin litzedakah, because those are the same things. And that's why Avram Avinu is, what's Avram Avinu? So the whole term of tzedakah mishpat is a term that in the first week we saw that God in Parshat Lecha said, do you know why I chose you? I chose you because I knew he dativ l'man asher yitzavet banav beito acharav lasot tzedakah u'mishpat. And what is Avram Avinu known for? His Hachnasat Orchim with Levaya, that's Gadol Mikulam. All of these pieces are actually come together in a particular view that is it's all about, it starts with not the other person's need, it actually starts with me recognizing the other person, seeing the other person, right? Seeing the other person and then being able to provide that person with support. And I will end with the last two English quotes on page 3. Which I did a long time ago. I use these as well, because I just think that this is the yesod. Emmanuel Levinas, a French Shomer Mitzvot philosopher, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, wrote lots of things on, I'm going to try to do this in 3 minutes. He basically, this is his yesod. His commitment was to trying to, he thought, to oversimplify it. He thought, and it's very, I can't read it, it's very hard to read, that's why it's like one sentence, and maybe we can do that. And he had a remarkable sway, there's a whole debate about how his philosophy is very Jewish, and it's actually out there in the world, and how it's kind of this fascinating thing to see a very Jewishly rooted philosophy that's being debated like all over the world. But his basic yesod was as follows. He wanted to do nothing less than kind of overturn all of Western philosophy by in the following way. We're used to saying, I think, therefore I am, following kind of Cartesian philosophy, which basically means that what makes me me is the fact that I can think and figure things out. And he said, that's not true. Because until you were able to think, there were other people who actually were providing for you and caring for you and getting you to that point. And so he says that care for the other is actually first philosophy. He calls it ethics as first philosophy. So it's like, what does that term mean? It means the start of philosophy is not my thinking about stuff. The start of philosophy is my caring for another person, meaning the root of figuring out, if philosophy is about figuring out how the world's supposed to work, that's not about me like abstractly thinking about the way the world's supposed to work. That's about me caring for other people. And that comes way before actually being able to philosophize and think on your own. So for him, that care for the other, recognize the other person, he has a whole thing about the face, recognizing it's like a whole thing. I want to read one sentence.
Reshit Chachma, Yirat Adonai.
Yes, what do you want to do with that? What do you mean? Except Yira is different.
Yira would be doing tzedakah, chesed. I think, therefore I am, so the beginning of wisdom is doing chesed.
It's not about knowledge and stuff like that. It's about doing the work of God. Okay, I hear that. So he says, the one line says like this. After when he says you're supposed to do he says, this is kind of his definition of social justice, says concretely, our effort consists in maintaining within anonymous community the society of the I with the other.
Like Uber.
Kind of. Right, except that a big part of the jump is on the level of society. There's an I and thou, he is an I and the other. The difference between I and thou is there's somebody who you feel their presence. The idea of the I and the other,
Somebody you don't even know.
somebody you have nothing to do with and you recognize that person. Now, that can happen in like a social circle where you don't know somebody, but he says the idea on the level of a city, and this is what he's talking about, is to be able to do that within anonymous community. Our effort consists in maintaining within anonymous community the society of the I with the other, meaning the goal is for us to be able to care about people, see people we don't see. Basic idea is to be able to see people that we don't see. And so, with this I will end. The idea is that, I think, trying to argue that based on starting the odd point of Eglah Arufa, and then kind of using the way the Rambam built off of Eglah Arufa, that the idea of trying to care for others and make sure is necessarily rooted in principles of economic distribution per se, although that might come as part of it. What it's really rooted in is the idea of recognizing other people who are in front of you, and that is the kind of the idea of doing it on a city level. Most definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.